Imagine waking up one morning, checking your phone, and realizing the savings you built for your family over a lifetime are suddenly gone. Not because you spent recklessly, because the bank announces a crisis, freezes your account, and then says in a cold, polite voice, "We are very sorry. There is nothing more we can do." What would you do? Bow your head and accept it. Sue in a system you know you cannot win against, or quietly nurture a thought most of us never dare to say out loud. If the system can rob you in one night, do you have the right to take something back? On January 13th, 2006, in Argentina, 6 men decided to answer that question with action. 300 police officers surrounded a luxury bank. 23 hostages lay face down on cold marble. The leader calmly demanded pizza. The guns in their hands would later turn out to be toys, and yet they still walked away with about $19 million, then vanished like smoke. On the front page, they were the heist crew of the century. But behind the masks, they were just people with families, with fear, with scars left behind by a financial collapse. And the thing that finally shattered what looked like a perfect plan was not a SWAT team or a sniper. It was a woman, a wife who felt so deeply betrayed that she did something no bullet could do. She ended the dark legend her husband had tried to write. In 2001, Argentinians woke up inside a nightmare with no gunfire, but the sound of collapse was deafening. The government declared a crisis. Banks froze accounts, limited withdrawals, called it a temporary measure. On paper, it was just numbers. On the street, it was fathers and mothers pounding on glass doors, crying in front of ATMs flashing error messages. The cafes where people used to drink mate and argue about soccer, filled with faces gone gray from worry. Everyone had the same question: where is my money? Some elderly people clutched old savings passbooks like they were holding a piece of their own life, and understood that every plan they had for old age had just been erased by a few cold lines of text. Bolster's family was one of them. They were not rich, just middle class and hardworking, saving every peso so their kids might have a better life. 80,000 pesos, a lifetime of work, turned into a meaningless number on a bank screen. No one kicked their door in. No thug put a pistol to their heads. Only a system saying one simple sentence: your funds are currently unavailable. His father stayed silent for so long, everyone thought he had not heard. His mother tried to act calm, but her hand shook when she touched the printed notice. Bolster watched that scene and understood. Some robberies do not need masks or weapons, but they still steal every sense of safety a family has. From that day on, for many Argentinians, the bank was no longer a place to trust. It looked more like a casino where the house always wins. And in Bolster's chest, that bitterness never really faded. It sat there like a stone at the bottom of a river, waiting for someone to pick it up and throw it back to the surface. Fernando Araujo's apartment was so small that if you spread a newspaper on the floor, there was barely room left to walk around it. Paint flaked off the walls. The window looked down on a noisy street where life had to go on as if nothing had happened, even though the whole country was carrying the scar of the crisis. Almost every afternoon, Fernando sat on the floor, his back against the wall, a half-finished joint between his fingers. Smoke drifted through the sunlight, turning the room into a hazy filter. On the table lay a stack of old newspapers, the pages yellowed from being read too many times. They were stories about the Ramallo bank siege in 1999, where police stormed a bank and killed 2 hostages live on television. Most people saw blood, screams, gunfire. Fernando saw something else. He saw the position of the door, the camera angle, the panic in the eyes of the hostage dragged to the window, the tension in the officers outside waiting for a command. He saw a stage built badly, a place where no one controlled the story, so tragedy took over. He asked himself, what if someone held the script from the beginning? What if the bank was the same, the hostages the same, the police the same, but the ending had no bodies, no shattered families, just one loud slap in the face of a system that had already stolen people's money. Outside, friends his age were choosing to leave the country, or to accept whatever odd job they could find, even if it had nothing to do with their dreams. Fernando was a failed artist. His paintings did not sell. His projects got no funding. The future felt like fog. His anger at the banks and his frustration with his own life started to blend together. In that cramped apartment, the thought that most of us would dismiss in a second began to put down roots in his mind. If the banks had used the law to rob an entire generation, could someone use imagination, use a perfect script, to rob them back without killing anyone? For Fernando, it was not just a heist. It was his one chance to turn his anger, his sense of injustice, and his talent for storytelling into a real-life movie. And the bank would be his main set. By day, Sebastian Garcia Bolster was just a mechanic in a hot, cramped shop on the edge of Buenos Aires. Oil stained his nails. His t-shirt was marked by grease. Exhaust fumes mixed with the buzz of engines and the static of an old radio. Customers came and went, complaining about strange noises from under the hood. In Bolster's head, the only noise he really heard was the number that had vanished from his family's bank account. 80,000 pesos, the sum his parents had saved over decades, for sickness, for emergencies, for a quiet old age, suddenly reduced to a cold line on a screen. Withdrawal limited, account frozen. No one pointed a gun at them, but the feeling of being robbed was just as sharp. Bolster had seen the empty stare in his father's eyes that day. The way his mother's hands shook as she tried to pretend everything was fine. Those images stuck to his memory like grease. They did not wash off. When Fernando showed up at the shop with crumpled blueprints and said the words Banco Río, Bolster's mind did not go to money first. It went to drainage maps, wall thickness, whether the foundation would hold if someone cut a hole under the vault, while other men might ask how much cash and how dangerous. His first questions were, how deep are the sewers? How thick is the concrete? Are there vibration sensors? For an engineer trapped in a mechanic's body, this was not just a robbery. It was the hardest problem of his life. How do you dig a tunnel hundreds of feet long through sewage, poison gas, and reinforced concrete without anyone noticing? How do you turn the city's dirtiest, most forgotten infrastructure into a secret escape route right under 300 cops? The more Fernando talked, the more something moved inside Bolster's chest. Part old anger at the bank, part professional pride. If the system had calculated so precisely that it could erase his family's safety with a few lines of policy, then he would answer in the only language he knew: measurement, planning, and turning a crazy idea into a real tunnel. The first night Bolster climbed down into the sewer, the city above him sounded normal. Buses, bars, people laughing. When the manhole cover closed over his head, all of that cut off like someone hitting mute on the world. Only water sounds remained, and the echo of his own footsteps on slick concrete. The smell of waste hit him full in the face, thick and heavy, a mixture of sweat, rot, and time. The lamp on his forehead swept across stained walls and slime. Rats scattered in every direction, their eyes flashing like tiny sparks in the dark. For most people, this was a place to avoid. For Bolster, it was a lab, the the site of the biggest project he would ever take on. He found the spot directly under the vault and pressed the drill against the concrete, thick and reinforced. Every time he squeezed the trigger, vibrations ran up his arms, into his bones, into his chest. 10 seconds of drilling, 10 seconds with the machine off, standing perfectly still, listening. Were there footsteps above? Any alarm? Any change in the heartbeat of the city? Then 10 more seconds drilling, 10 more in silence, night after night. One time, the gas monitor on his belt started screaming, methane spiking. One spark and the tunnel would become a bomb. Bolster pulled back, sat on the edge of the flow, and waited until the numbers dropped. In that moment, he knew very clearly, if something happened down here, no one would know where he died. No funeral, no headline, just a man who vanished into the guts of the city. Another night, his beam caught a face, a homeless man curled on a piece of cardboard, living in what everyone else considered garbage. The man stared at Bolster for a second, then turned away, as if he had seen plenty of people forced to hide underground to survive. They did not speak, but in that brief moment, Bolster understood he was not entirely alone. There was a whole layer of people the country had pushed beneath its feet. Every night when he finally got home, he was exhausted, but his eyes were brighter. Every centimeter of concrete he erased was one step closer to the vault, and also one way of answering his past. If the bank had buried his family's future with a decision, he would dig back up toward it. One burst of the drill, one breath in the dark at a time. 12:28 p.m. on a hot Friday in Acasuso. On the surface, people were thinking about lunch and weekend plans. Underground, Bolster tightened the strap on his mask and adjusted the lamp on his forehead. He took in the damp, sour air of the tunnels, a smell that had become strangely tied to hope in his mind. Beto and Doc walked behind him, wading through murky water up to their shins. No one spoke, only water slapping concrete, fabric brushing walls. They all knew that once they walked through this day, they would never again be just a mechanic, a pool hall legend, or a patient scout. They would either enter history or disappear in a failed headline. 12:31. At street level, the glass doors of Banco Río slid open, cool air blowing out from the air conditioning. Vitet, Fernando, and Doc stepped in. Dressed like three middle-class men there to do business, an elderly woman clutched her purse as she waited her turn. A young man in a dress shirt nervously fiddled with his safe deposit key in his pocket. A teller smiled with practiced politeness, greeting them like any other customer. None of the 23 people inside knew that, in a few minutes, their lives would be tied forever to the phrase, the heist of the century. When Vitet leaned on the information desk and asked about opening an account, his voice was calm, almost friendly. The moment the security guard turned his head toward the street, Vitet's hand slid to the toy gun weighted with lead. A small motion, but it was like pulling back the curtain on a stage that had already been built. Marble floors, teller counters, rows of waiting chairs. All of it suddenly became set dressing. 15 minutes later, police got the first call about a robbery, and the countdown started for both sides. From 12:45 to 1:15, the whole city seemed to zoom its lens onto one building. Patrol cars screamed in, forming a ring around the bank. Curious neighbors gathered behind tape, trying to see inside, where 23 hostages lay face down, hands over their heads on cold stone. Someone whispered prayers. Someone else secretly called a loved one to say they were okay, their voice still shaking. On a rooftop across the street, snipers lay flat, rifles pointed at panes of glass. They saw only shadows moving inside. never sure if they were aiming at criminals or innocents. Down below, deep in the sewer, Bolster paused his drilling and looked up at the concrete ceiling, as if he could somehow see the chaos above through the rock. Two worlds, separated by only a few feet, both holding their breath to see where Fernando's script would go. 2:47 p.m. With the tension pulled so tight it felt like it could snap, Walter picked up the phone and calmly asked for something that froze the command room for a second. 30 pizzas. Enough for the hostages and the robbers. On the other end, a few officers laughed. Somebody said, "They are getting scared. Empty stomachs go soft." The order was approved. A line of delivery guys rolled up to the locked bank, escorted by armed police. Inside, the smell of hot dough, melted cheese, and oregano floated above the cold floor, mixing with sweat and fear. A bank clerk's hand still shook as she held her first slice, eating and glancing at the masked man. An older customer tried to give his share to the young woman lying beside him. As if one small gesture could salvage some dignity in the moment, where his face had been pressed into the ground. One hostage would later say it was the strangest meal of their life, not knowing if they were tasting their last bite, or a story they would tell years later. Meanwhile, under the vault, the hydraulic ram snarled in short bursts. Each safe deposit box popped open like a mouth revealing its owner's secret life. Some spilled stacks of dollars and euros, neatly arranged. Others held gold, diamonds, loose gemstones rolling across the tile like tiny stars. And then there were the boxes that contained only family photos, faded letters, little objects priceless to one person but worthless on any market. Those boxes they closed and left alone. The duffel bags grew heavier, bulging. On the surface, it looked like the robbers were killing time with pizza. Underneath, they were packing a chunk of the neighborhood's wealth and memories into filthy, sewer-soaked bags, getting ready to vanish with them. 3:27 p.m. In the stale air of the vault, Bolster checked his watch one last time. It was enough. The bags were full of cash, gold, and stones. Before they left, Fernando pulled out a piece of paper and calmly taped it to the wall between the torn open boxes. The handwriting was rough, but the message was sharp. Without weapons, without grudges, it is just money, not love. It was a declaration, a statement, and a defense for everything they had just done. Minutes later, each figure slipped back through the round hole in the floor, dropping into the tunnel where they had first entered. Water slapped against concrete. Heavy bags bumped together. Their breathing was hard, part exhaustion, part relief. Above them, on the ground floor, hostages still lay still, convinced that gunshots could come at any moment. Outside, police yelled into radios. Reporters stretched every sentence on camera to fill the waiting. 4 hours later, when the last door was breached, what the tactical team found stopped them cold. 23 hostages locked in a conference room, shaken but alive. Half-eaten pizza boxes scattered around, and on the floor, toy guns laid out neatly like a cruel joke. No robbers, no shootout, no clear victory to toast later. When officers shined their flashlights down the round hole into the sewer, the beam was swallowed by darkness. Next to it, the note about no weapons, no grudges, just money, not love, hit the entire system like ice water. Overnight, TV and newspapers filled with headlines that were both angry and impressed. They robbed us with toys. Police guarded an empty stage. On the radio, callers argued. Some called it a blatant crime. Others quietly said at least no one died, and the bank was not exactly innocent. A few hostages went on camera and described the robbers as polite. apologizing when they had to tie their hands, making sure they had food and water, trying not to scare the children. In a country that had watched banks wipe out their savings, public feelings split down the middle, one half furious that the law had been mocked, the other half unable to hide a smile, imagining 300 armed officers and, in the end, nothing to show but cold pizza and plastic guns as evidence. In a small house on the outskirts of the city, Alicia started to notice things in her supposedly normal life that did not add up. A floor tile that sounded hollow underfoot. A patch of fresh paint that did not quite match the wall in the bedroom. A water heater that seemed oddly heavy. Every time she pulled at a loose edge or unscrewed a panel, the answer was the same. Bundles of dollar bills wrapped in plastic, stuffed into places only someone both clever and very afraid would think to use. If it had only been the money, Alicia might have stayed quiet. But then came the messages, the hurried calls cut short. The nights Beto said he was seeing friends and came home with a different perfume on his shirt. A younger woman. A plan to leave for Paraguay. A future where she and their child did not exist. The feeling of being lied to. Being replaced, cut deeper than the bank crisis ever had. The night she pounded on the other woman's door, shouting that her husband was one of the Banco Río robbers. Neighbors called the police. No one in that hallway knew that the raw, messy pain of a betrayed wife was the key the police had been missing. Days later, Alicia walked into police headquarters, sat down, and started giving names. Meetings held in her own kitchen. Snatches of the conversation about tunnels, toy guns, pizza. The arrests came before dawn. Beto was dragged from his bed. Cash piled in closets and under the mattress. Vitet, Doc, Fernando, Bolster, and Zalo were all handcuffed in turn. In court, they still carried themselves as if they were finishing the last act of a play. They talked about art, about an unjust system, about the fact that no one had died. Outside, crowds split. Some chanted in support. Others demanded heavy sentences. Only a small fraction of the stolen money was ever found. The rest, roughly $17 million, simply vanished from the record. Some people believed it was buried somewhere. Others thought it had been laundered and invested, quietly growing interest while its owners served time. The story ended, but it never really closed. Because in the end, one question stayed in the air. Were they greedy criminals, or men who did what an entire generation wished it could do to the banks that had taken everything? And if you step into Alicia's pain for a moment, you see something else. Sometimes what destroys a perfect plan is not law or force. It is the heart of a wife who believes justice has ignored her for far too long. In the end, the Banco Río heist is not just a wild story about tunnels, pizza, and toy guns. It is a mirror held up to how people react when they are pushed to the edge. When a bank can wipe out a generation's savings with a few lines of policy, a group of men robbing that bank forces the whole society to face a hard question. What is justice? Who does the law really protect? And where exactly is the line between criminal and hero? Fernando, Bolster, Beto, Vitet, they were not born monsters. They were a failed artist, a middle-class mechanic, a father, a husband. What pushed them away from ordinary life was the feeling of being betrayed by the system. But the thing that finally destroyed their perfect plan was not that system. It was something much closer. A broken marriage, a wife who had been lied to, a heart hurt deeply enough to decide to walk into a police station and talk. The lesson is here. Money can buy tools, lawyers, weapons, even a tunnel under a bank. It can even buy a moment of sympathy from a crowd that hates the banks. But money cannot buy loyalty. It cannot buy back trust once you have shattered it in the person next to you. In the same way, a financial system can excuse itself with technical words and legal terms. Yet once it breaks the trust of ordinary people, everything built on top of that trust becomes fragile. For us as viewers, this story is a warning on two fronts. First, do not fall for the illusion that being clever is enough to beat everyone and everything. Second, do not cling blindly to the idea that the rules will always be on your side. Between those two extremes, the only thing that really keeps us from repeating the same kind of tragedy is honesty. Honesty in how we earn our money. Honesty with the people who walk beside us. And honesty when we finally have to ask ourselves one last question. Who am I going to choose to become when injustice knocks on my door?